rounds here at the RCSI's Institute of Global Surgery. We're really honored this afternoon, to have Dr. Bethany Hedt-Gauthier, whom I'll introduce in just a second, talk to us about research equity in global surgery. But before I do, some housekeeping, which Deirdre has already put into the chat. First, this talk is going to be recorded, and hopefully we can figure out the technical aspects of it. Will be available on our website within the next couple of weeks. Second, Dr. Hedt-Gauthier is going to be speaking for 25 minutes, half an hour or so, and then we've left some time after her talk for a Q&A session. So throughout the course of her talk, there's a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you want to put your questions into the Q&A box or into the chat box, I'll be relaying them to her afterwards. That's all we have for housekeeping. With that, let me introduce Dr. Hedt-Gauthier, who is a biostatistician whom I've known for, I don't know, a decade at this point, maybe. She specializes in implementation science and health systems research in sub-Saharan Africa. Her portfolio of research is on global surgery, focusing on care and outcomes in rural Rwanda. Dr. Hedt-Gauthier is committed to improving partnerships in global health research, both by innovating within her own practice and by leading research and advocacy on issues of power dynamics and inequitable research collaborations. And with that, Dr. Hedt-Gauthier, over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Mark. And it is an honor to be here for this ground rounds and this inaugural ground rounds. I'm very flattered to be invited. And it sounds like these are conversations that are happening actively within the Royal College of Surgeons and certainly happening within our spaces. So I am happy to facilitate this conversation. I really tried to present this from a very honest and vulnerable and reflective space. And so my goal here is to share some of my current thoughts and the people who have shaped those thoughts, and then to open it up for conversation. Before I get started, I would be remiss to not acknowledge that today is the 27th commemoration of the genocide in Rwanda. And for any colleagues and friends who are joining from Rwanda, just know that my thoughts are with you today as well. I have a pretty simple outline for today. Make sure this is advancing. The first is just to talk about my position that the field of global surgery research is inequitable, and then to share some thoughts about how we can address the inequities within this field. And again, this is meant to just provoke conversation and thought, so please do message as you have questions or ideas that you want to contribute to the conversation. I oftentimes start, when I have conversations about equity and inequities in the field of global health, start with this idea that, from my perspective, research is a field full of commodities. So if we were talking about an industry that had precious gems as the product of that industry, it might be easier to talk about or to identify equity or inequity when it exists. What's challenging about research is our commodities within the research practice are oftentimes less tangible. So it can be things that you can count, things like authorship, training opportunities, or they can be things that are less concrete, things like data and ideas. And so, when we talk about the commodities that we exchange within the field of research, it's important to think about them as resources that can be earned, as resources that can be shared, that can be given, that can be obstructed. That these are not just things that exist in equity for all to access, but really things that are commoditized in the field itself. And then what do I mean by equity? So from my perspective, equity is a just and fair sharing of commodities across all engaged and or affected, in this case, engaged or affected by the research that we conduct. And I want to also emphasize that from my perspective, equity is not equal. I want to emphasize, a lot of times when we talk about things like fair sharing of training opportunities or occupations, a lot of times folks will say, well, because of the situation, you wouldn't expect there to be as much competition for faculty jobs or for authorship. That's not what I mean by not being equal. What I mean is an equal sharing of authorship is our bare minimum. And really, we should be striving for fields where I might be invited to be a collaborator because I have a specific expertise folks want to engage, or because they like working with me, but I'm not necessarily by default having my presence in this space. And for those of you who know me or know some of my work, I do oftentimes talk about authorship, and I'm going to present some slides about authorship as an indicator of equity or inequity in global surgery. But I first want to recognize that authorship is an imperfect indicator. The first thing that comes to mind is the paper that Sheye Abimbola wrote as a complementary editorial to the paper I'll refer to on the next slide, that basically is saying that who is writing and for whom they write may make conversations around equity in authorship more of a moot point. It's a foreign gaze. It's not really written by or for local audiences where the research is being conducted. His piece that just came out, I think actually yesterday, maybe the day before, his newer piece, I think even pushes that idea further, which effectively says the whole system of production and publishing of knowledge is unjust. If you read his conclusion of that, is an unjust system. And so in that context, you know, we're talking about equity metrics of an unjust system, and it further complicates how we interrogate authorship and think about authorship in these contexts. So with that, I do want to present some authorship indicators that I think are interesting to look at. So this is a paper that we published. This is about health in Africa, where we looked at 7,100 papers published about health in a specific African country and looked at the number of collaborators that came from the country that the research was about. And we found that overall, a little over 50% of all authors were from the country that the paper was about. And that maintained that level in the first, middle, and senior author positions. However, what we found in addition to that was that who are the collaborative authors really affects this dynamic. And what I was particularly interested in was collaborating authors coming from US institutions, and specifically some of the top ranking universities and US institutions. And when you look at those collaborative dynamics, you find the inclusion of local authors, when one of the collaborators is from a top 20 US school of public health, drops to 40%. And then it drops even more pronounced in the prime desired first and senior author positions. And so collaborators from high profile US institutions are less inclusive of colleagues from the country where the research is being conducted than even the norm in the field, which is, again, from my perspective, at sort of the bare minimum of what we would want in terms of an equity perspective. I've done a quick analysis of that data, just specifically pulling out the about 400 papers during this 3-year window that looked at surgery. And it is a very crude analysis, but the punchline is that the baseline set point for surgery papers, which are the shaded bars, is even lower than what we were seeing overall. And the effect of collaborating with colleagues from top institutions in the US had an even more pronounced effect than in the prime positions than what we were seeing overall. So certainly this points to me that the field of global surgery has similar, if not even more pronounced, challenges in terms of engagement of colleagues from the countries where we're doing the work than just global health in general, which is already quite challenged. And then there's many other examples. I just put 4 here, but I could probably provide 30 other papers that talk about equity in the field of global surgery research, all of which looking at different aspects. Some continuing to look at authorship. This paper from Uganda talks quite a bit about the types of research that's pursued and the alignment of that research to local priorities. And then a paper recently from colleagues at the Program of Global Surgery looking at equity and access to presenting at international conferences. This paper by Schiffman helps me understand the power dynamics at play and the resources that we rely on to promote ourselves or promote our work or promote the work of our colleagues. And he breaks it down into four levels of capital. So cultural capital will be things like your credentials. So having an MD or a PhD or a bachelor's degree in statistics. So your credentials combined with other norms in the field like styles of speech, styles of writing, styles of presenting will fall into cultural capital. Social capital is largely your networks. And I have to say, probably one of the most valuable resources I have professionally is the networks that allow me to be seen and invited for talks like this. And so social capital is a huge resource when you're talking about power dynamics in this work. Financial capital, which is the more concrete resources, funding, infrastructure that can help facilitate the work. And then symbolic capital, which is one that I keep coming back to as even more important than I first recognized when I read this paper, which is the legitimacy, how an individual is legitimized, as seen as being a contributor in the field, or their idea is important to the field. So who do we see walk into a room and say, I want to hear what that person has to say, or that person is legitimately right to be here? And as we think about these capitals, we have to recognize that the present day ownership of this capital, or having of this capital, has been and continues to be shaped by racism and colonialism. It is just a fact, and we'll come back to this idea, and something that we have to recognize, that this is not historic, this is present, and it continues to shape how we operate and how the power dynamics play out in global surgery research. So with that as a background, I do think it's really important to think about how we can address inequities in this field. So the first step from my perspective is just, we need an honest interrogation. We need to have some very frank conversations about who we are and how we operate in this space. So right now, I just want to say that when I talk about who we are and how we operate in this space, I'm specifically talking about what Dr. Amambola refers to in his most recent paper, the professors, the folks who are operating from like academic standpoints and academic institutions. I talk about it from that space because that is where I sit and where I feel like I can offer the most unique perspective. I do recognize there's a lot of other we's in this space that we need to also think about how these apply there. But just for right now, know that when I talk about our interrogation, I'm talking about those of us who sit in academic spaces, and particularly those of us who sit in programs housed at universities in high-income countries. So the first part of the honest interrogation is thinking about, why are we here? And for this, in a more personal space, I want to reflect back on my first extended experience outside of the US, which was as a high school math teacher in northern Namibia, where I was a Peace Corps volunteer for 3 years. So first of all, for me, there's interrogation about the program of Peace Corps. And I will say that, even that as a program, a volunteer going to work outside of the US for 3 years is something that we should be thinking about and talking about that in the global space. The point I want to highlight here was this time in Namibia really had me think about, why do we have structures such that a 23-year-old math major would be a valued asset at a rural school in northern Namibia? And for those of you who don't know the history of Namibia, it was ruled under 3 different colonizers. The most recent colonizer was South Africa, that ruled Namibia under an apartheid system. And part of the apartheid system was the Bantu education system, which systematically denied math and science education to any public school attendee. So basically, the general population was not taught math and science for 30 years in Namibia. When I lived in Namibia, it was 10 years post-apartheid, and the schools were back to offering these things, but you can think about 2 generations of teachers who were never taught math and science. And so my role was to help bridge that gap. I think about that experience a lot now when I think about the university systems and the opportunity for these university systems to grow in the way that they want to grow and have the resources that they need to lead the research that they want to lead. This apartheid example is a very extreme example, but if you look back at the way colonialism has shaped education systems, the way that we continue through our funding through World Bank and the IMF, the way that we push and pull on education systems in various countries, taking away autonomy, it really does affect the university's ability to lead their own research, to build their own infrastructure for research. And that is the space that we operate in. I think about this also from the fact that, I can talk about apartheid as a relic of a colonial regime, but the reality is that we continue to exist in these systems and to some degree, actually, by and large, benefit from those inequities that exist in those systems and may consciously or unconsciously be perpetuating those inequities because it is to our benefit. And to that end, I want to point you to this presentation that excuse me, two of our colleagues gave recently on mending the colonial roots in global surgery. So this is available if you'd like to listen to it. But one of the points that jumped out to me was their conversations around there is this historical root of colonialism and global surgery, but those have direct analogs to how we operate today. And that we still, again, are perpetuating some of these inequities because it benefits us us professors. It benefits us to have, for example, less rigorous IRBs or, having the power dynamics to engage a colleague when it's convenient for us, but to not be true collaborative partners. As we talk about why we are here as programs, I also think it's really critical for any individual operating in this space to interrogate why you are here as an individual. And so I want to point you to this presentation given by Collins Irhiambua on culture and race and global health research. I went back to listen to his talk a couple days ago for the purposes of preparing for today, and I had a very specific thing in mind that I wanted to highlight, and then basically found myself almost doing a pared down version of his presentation for this. So I just wanted to say, if there's one thing you take away from this, I really want to encourage you to watch this lecture. It is full of so many insights in terms of who we are in the space and how we operate. But the one that specifically came to mind was his conversations around identity and the importance of all of us in this space recognizing who we are as we operate here. How do we come to this work? Why do we come to this work? How do we operate in this space? And he had a series of points that he made around this, largely around reflecting on his own experience in graduate schools, where when he learned about his Nigerian parents, he learned about them in terms of the deficits that they had and not the strengths and the values and the opportunities that they brought to the table. And so this point to me really jumped out. We need to always start with the positive. What I say, if you go into a community or you're working with any group, you need to find out some of the positive things and begin with the positives. If you cannot find something positive, you need to get out or you will become part of the problem. And I do think part of my personal interrogation is thinking about, why am I here? Am I here to solve, is there the white saviorism in the work that I do? Am I here to solve some problem? Or am I here in partnership? Am I here because of a love of a question or a collaborator? These interrogations I do think are important. So I've recently changed when I'm invited to give, who are you and professional pathways for statisticians. I've recently changed how I introduce myself and have made it, again, much more personal about my own identity. I am a lover of mathematics. I am a math nerd. I am someone who was raised by parents who had careers based in equity and social justice and was really influenced by that. I am someone who happened to travel to South Africa in college and just made really deep personal connections that it sparked a love of travel, that sparked a love of the region. And I've had the privilege of living half of the last 20 years in Africa. So while I could be doing statistical and equity work in Boston, I am drawn to my collaborations and to the environment in Rwanda where I've worked for the last decade. I'm a health systems researcher, I'm a teacher, a trainer, a mentor, I'm a learner along with all of that. And then I also conduct global surgery research looking at surgical care and outcomes. And I put this picture here. I was trying to find the picture that really captures all of this for me. But this is my daughter, Allison, along with my mother, Alice, and then 3 of my colleagues named Alice. And so for me, this work is deeply personal. It's very individual. It's very familiar. And that has been important for my work. And one of my draws is, getting to go back and see friends and collaborators as we continue to conduct this work together. The other part of the interrogation, why am I here? I can answer that question. And then I really have to think about how do I operate in the space? And I've oftentimes recommended this paper from our surgical colleague, Desmond Jabam, on how not to write about global health as part of my interrogation. So when this paper came out, I'm sure many of you saw it was highly circulated. And I remember reading it and be like, yeah. And then getting to a part and be like, oh, wait, he's talking about me. And I do think this piece, the style that it's written, is a helpful interrogation of my own operation in this space to think about, am I the person who basically writes a grant without a lot of input from colleagues, knowing like, well, if we get the funding, then we can have conversations about that grant. So I do think if you're looking for a way to interrogate your own practice, reading this paper and really reflecting on, is he talking about the field or is he personally talking about you and how you operate in the space, for me has been a great reflective process. I really appreciate and want to encourage those of you from RCSI or those of you from other programs to think about how you can support and facilitate these interrogations within your own space in your own collaborative groups. I want to point out that the leadership and really pushed by the phenomenal group of fellows and RAs currently within the program has just recently released an anti-racism statement that is incredibly powerful and has really, just even the process of developing the statement has really pushed our group to interrogate who we are and how we operate in the space. And then in parallel to that, again, a group of fellows and RAs who've led an anti-racism curriculum that hosts a session every other week and has for many, many months now, that really helps us pick apart how, who are we as a program, who are we as individuals, how do we operate in the space? And so again, want to encourage other programs to consider doing likewise. A second point of how we can address inequities in the field of global surgery research is I do think it is important to measure and evaluate. So this is a snapshot of the most recent draft of our strategic plan. And I want to give credit to the colleagues who developed this. I'm currently co-leading the research pillar with our colleague Adeline Boatin. And these ideas really came from the fellows and RAs, and we've pushed it forward. But as part of our research pillar for our strategic plan, we want to develop and apply an equity framework as we assess our research practice. And when that framework is developed, the plan is that we will implement this framework on a regular basis. So internally, we will have every 6 months a review of the publications that we're writing, the conferences that we're going to, who we're supporting in both publications and conferences. And we will have an internal and again, very honest interrogation of our research collaborative practices. And then the intention is that every 2 years, we will write a public report talking about how we operate in this space. And I do think this measurement and evaluation will hold us to a higher standard and really push us to be more equitable in our collaborative practice. But then I listened to this podcast a couple weeks ago that really got me to challenge, like, should we be measuring? Should we be pushing these metrics? So this is the Brene Brown podcast on leadership, her interview with Bethia. And one of the points that Bethia pointed out was when you just start making a list of quantitative measurements and pushing for that, it can really become transactional. So it becomes, okay, Bethany said we should have 50% of our co-authors be from the country where we're doing research. So let's just put some names on the list, or let's not write that paper because we can't figure out how to achieve it. And it really becomes more about achieving metrics rather than about true transformative change that leads to better collaboration, and true transformative change that leads to authorship that's really engaged in contributing both to the ideas as they're generated and to the work as it's being disseminated. And so she talks about in that how you complement these metrics, and she does emphasize these metrics are important, but how you complement these metrics with better understanding of those affected by the work for transformational change. So I pulled this quote, but just briefly, I think in operationalizing it, it puts pressures on people, and they might not understand exactly why. They may not be totally sold on it, and they're just counting widgets. But the aspect of transformative work, it is creating connection. It requires empathy. It requires actually hearing stories from one another. And I will tell you about the aspect of being a learner when you're in the transformative part. It's not just about changing the culture of the work, it's changing people. So I do think we need to not just count widgets and count authorship, but we need to be working on this transformational change in our work. And so drawing from Bethia's recommendations, it's about really taking the time to understand how the current practice of global health is affecting colleagues around the world. I just want to acknowledge Chisoma Kalinga is a voice that really has pushed me to be more aware of how the work that I do affects multiple players that I may not have been as aware of. And so I put her Twitter handle here. She publishes quite a bit on this work. Put her Twitter handle here. This is just one of Dr. Kalinga's papers. So why don't more African researchers speak up? Many do, but the real question is, why won't Western institutions, funders listen to us? My experience shows that junior Indigenous staff are routinely disregarded. And then I won't read the whole quote, but just I think it's important to recognize this last one, and the early African researchers, PhD students, know the flimsiness of their careers. I've put a few other examples of this here. So this work, field workers saw their work as important, but recognized had a perceived unfairness around their lack of opportunities. I think this is an important one about the Kimry doctors who sued and won, but then eventually lost on appeal a lawsuit. The original ruling, the systemic discrimination, had significant detrimental effect on the researchers. They've not only lost a chance to renew their employment and connected scholarship, but have lost significant research outcomes as a result of the discriminative practices. And then this one that just came out a few days ago, and it really jumped out at me as being important to include because it features global surgery powerhouse, Salome Msume. But there's many different researchers highlighted here sharing their personal narratives about how inequities in global surgery, or sorry, this was in global health research in general, although Salome does talk about global surgery, how this affects their careers and their opportunities for advancement. So I think all of these are really important, that we need to seek out this understanding and this empathy by having close and personal relationships with our collaborators, also through consuming the work that's out there that people are publishing. And I also think it's really important that we recognize that the colleagues who talk about this and who write about this are in incredibly vulnerable positions in terms of the pushback that they may get from sharing these very personal and oftentimes these experiences that are against people in power, and so they may receive pushback from that. So in addition to being consumers of this work, we also need to recognize the vulnerabilities of the individuals who are publishing and do our best to protect them as they share these very personal narratives. My fourth recommendation is we do just need to adopt very pragmatic strategies to improve practice. So I highlight here a paper that I wrote with my closest collaborators, Robert Riviello and Fred Katera, who are both co-PIs on most of my surgery work, and then Teo Nesson-Kuruziza, who was our research manager for many years. And here we highlight the fact that we have a collaborative team that includes colleagues from the Program of Global Surgery and Social Change, Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's, from Inshuti Mubuzima, Partners in Health Rwanda, from the Ministry of Health, from the University of Global Health Equity, and that we've been very intentional in growing this body of work with the focus on both equity in what we study, but also equity in how we study it. And so the recommendations highlighted there, one is as we lead trainings, and when I say trainings, I'm talking about trainings of our colleagues in Rwanda, trainings of our colleagues in PGSSC, as we lead trainings, that we're very intentional that we put global surgery as the focus of that training. So most of our trainings will work towards papers, and we try to work towards surgery research papers to build up our teams, but also to build up our portfolio to make us more competitive for grants. We link surgical fellows that are part of PGSSC to site-based research and to facilitate joint learning. We work out collaboration and plans with Fred in Rwanda, and more recently Vincent Chibaka, who's the director of research for Inshuti Mubuzima. And they're very clear on what they can and cannot accept. So someone is welcome to come here, but they have to come for 9 months. If they come here for 9 months, these are the things that they need to support our program in. And we develop, even before we extend the invitation, we develop very detailed plans to help us think through how we're going to engage the fellows and support their trainings, and how we're going to engage our other more junior members of our team and support their training, and to facilitate those joint learning opportunities between them. And then we are just constantly mapping out our research space. So our feeling is there is more than enough research to do and to go around. And so we're constantly sketching out our ideas and topics. And then as we sketch out ideas and topics, who we think will be the first author, who we think will be the senior author. And this doesn't only help us ensure that there's equity in terms of counting authorships in the representation of authorship on our papers, it also helps us ensure that we're not forgetting somebody, or that we're not inadvertently leaving someone out of an opportunity to grow them. So Rachel Koch, who was a fellow a few years ago, our commitment to our fellows is to support them in learning about research and to getting to publication. So this helps me make sure that Rachel has that opportunity as part of our fellowship. But it also helps me make sure that another colleague, for example, Laban Bikaramana, that he's a more junior member of our team. So as we make this list, Fred and Robert and I might say something like, well, Laban is up and coming, so let's think ahead a year from now, what paper can he lead, and how can we support him to lead it, and how can we, in the process of being engaged on Rachel's paper, ensure that he has that opportunity. And we spend a lot of time looking at this list and just really having these intense conversations. It's not just about authorship, but it's about opportunity, it's about training, it's about engagement. And this has been really helpful for us. My fifth recommendation is we just have to start fundamentally challenging and reshaping these systems. I started making the list. I was like, we need to change funding models. We need to change publishing models. We need to change training models. And then I realized all of it is just really broken. And we need to be challenging how all of these systems work and working towards reshaping how these systems work to try and reshape the system. And so with that, a few years ago, one of my biggest challenges is the academic promotion pressures that I have as an associate professor are at direct odds with equity. I mean, it is a hard statement to say, but it's a very true statement. And so we wrote this recommendation on what changes we thought needed to happen in academic promotion processes that could really promote equity and research collaborations. And then we have this recent paper led by 3 of our research associates who are individuals who are currently in medical school, who've really revisited how global health education was presented to them as part of their medical school training, and making recommendations for how that presentation and their growth opportunity as individuals interested in global surgery could have been improved to have a better focus on equity in their work. And then finally, I'm going to end on the one that I am the least formed on, which is thinking about how we redistribute and redefine this capital. So I mentioned the capital that Schiffman describes as being really important for forming who has power and how they operate in this space. And something I am currently really thinking about is, should I use my capital? So for example, my network capital. If I have a paper that I think would be a really great paper in a certain journal, do I use my network capital to reach out to the editor? Do I use my financial capital to get a research assistant to help me be more productive? How do I use my capital? And I think where I've landed, and again, I'd love some conversation on this, I think where I've landed is, if I don't use my capital to some degree for myself, I'm just not going to succeed in this field. The truth is, everybody around me is using this capital to promote themselves and to promote their work. I think the better question for me is, how do I use my capital not just to advance my work, but to advance others around me who may not have network capital, who may not have financial capital. So if I am legitimized by the NIH because I have a PhD and because I've written a certain number of papers, can I use that legitimacy capital to help write the grant for my colleague to do the work that she wants to do? And so I think where I'm landing on this is, I do need to use my capital for myself, but I also need to challenge myself to use my capital to support other people who may not have that capital themselves. The other thing I'm challenging myself on is to value more diverse forms of capital. So this idea that you have to have a PhD to get an NIH grant, or an MD, MPH to get an NIH grant, I think is just really challenging and hard for me. And again, I think it's a lot of what Dr. Amambola wrote about in his most recent piece. It's just unjust the way that we legitimize certain forms of knowledge and certain forms of production, but delegitimize other forms of knowledge and other forms of production in this space. So in conclusion, I do believe that the field of global surgery is currently inequitable. I think the field of global health is currently inequitable. I think we really need to challenge these inequities. And I provide a few suggestions here. Again, I would love for this list to be challenged and added to, but some suggestions here about how we might be able to address the inequities in this field. And I just want to end with a thank you. I feel so privileged to do this work. I love the work that I do and the colleagues that I get to collaborate. And I'm very appreciative for this opportunity to speak with all of you. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Bethany, thank you very much. That was brilliant. A few questions in the Q&A box. One I want to address first of all, which is Katie Fernandez has asked if it's possible to share a link to Barnabas and Lisa's video. I haven't been able to find it. I see Lisa is in the participant list, but if you do have a link somewhere, if you would email it to me, we can email it out to the attendees here.
And I'll one up you on that. I will email out links to every single thing I have in this presentation, and if you can just post it with the video, that would be great.
Perfect. We can take that one up. Awesome. All right. So first question here is, how are we able to reconcile the barrier of requiring sort of perfect written English with the fact that English is not necessarily the first language or even a commonly spoken language in some of the countries in which we work?
That's a great question. So one response to that is, if again, we're just fundamentally changing the spaces, is do we need to challenge this idea that ideas have to be articulated in perfectly formed English to be worthy of sharing? I think the reality is we're probably a long way from that being the accepted norm. So what do we do in the interim? A lot of the work that we do is taking someone like myself who may have better statistical training or may have a better ability to write, which is, for those of you who know me, is almost comical because I'm actually not a very strong writer. Statisticians typically are not strong writers. And pairing me with someone who has really a deeper understanding of the research, the questions, the issues that we're addressing in that. And we will partner together and we will co-write something, but in real time. So for those of you who've been involved with me in this process, what it might look like. And again, I do this, I'm not defining this by geographies. I do this with my mentees, a few of you who are on this call, mentees in the US who may just be newer to writing and struggling with writing. But we just sit down with a document and that they've drafted and we go line by line and think about, what is the idea you're trying to convey? Is the sentence as it's currently written conveying that idea? How can we massage this into something that is more clearly communicated and understood? And so we call that real-time editing. We do that a lot in our practice in terms of just helping get the writing up to where we want it to be. There's other services like the pre-pest service that Ella August has been supporting that helps individuals go through a pre-peer review. And so I would recommend that for those of you. I think the requirement is you have to have published one paper prior to go through that. It's a great training on how to do peer review. And then for those of you who are writing one of your first papers, it's a great service to get the type of feedback a peer reviewer would give you before you've actually started the peer review process.
That's great. This is, I'm going to admit here, this is our first time using this particular platform. I see 2 hands raised, and I'm not sure attendees can actually speak in this platform. So Joey Villanueva, I'm going to see if you can do it.
I saw
looks like you can.
somebody pop up.
Looks like you're muted though. Maybe Chris Lavi, are you able to speak?
Oh, I can. I was busy typing
oh, perfect. Go for it.
A question, but I can speak it out to you. Hi, Beth. For some reason I've lost you on the screen. I can only see myself. What do you do if you, or what would you advise to do if you, as somebody who's been very involved in the area that you're working, identifies a need for research, a clinical need for research, or an area for research, but no one else agrees with you? In other words, you can't find any local collaborators. What do you do?
I'm going to answer the question as I heard it, but I'm not sure it's the question that you asked. So Chris, I'd stay on and push me more if I'm not answering the right question. I think if I have identified an area that I think is of key importance and I can't get anybody on board, to me, that's generally an indication that is not a question of key importance. I have lots and lots of ideas. And generally what we try to do in our collaborative teams is for me to make a list of my ideas, for my colleagues to make a list of their ideas, and for us to find the intersection of those ideas. But the default priority is to their areas of interest. And there are certainly ideas that I thought were phenomenal. I'm sure they were phenomenal. There were ideas that I thought were phenomenal that got tabled because there was no interest or engagement from colleagues again, most of my work is in Rwanda, from colleagues in Rwanda. So I'm not sure that was the question that you were answering. Do you want to ask a follow-up?
No, because you answered it very well, and thank you very much, and thanks for the talk and the challenges in it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris and Bethany. Another question from the Q&A box. Sean Tierney asks, you highlight the challenge in academic promotions, which might be counterproductive. Maybe you might expand on the issue of funders, grant assessments, and what needs to be done in this area, because funding probably drives most of the problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge. What I oftentimes say is there's the work as I want to do it and the work as I'm expected to do it. And so I oftentimes feel like I have two jobs, trying to balance the two. And I do think funding is a big issue. At the end of the day, part of what I'll be assessed on in my academic promotion is how much funding I've brought to the university, and how well funded I am for my work. So I alluded to this a bit, and it does tie into Chris's question as well. As we're outlining our research priorities, part of how we think about what we're going to move forward is what we could get funding to do. Particularly most of my work is in the context of an implementing organization. And so we don't have the luxury of just doing research for the sake of research. It has to be funded, otherwise it drains resources from the implementation projects. And so we do talk about like what can get funding. We talk quite a bit about how we might take an idea and tailor it to a funder's interest without losing the core of what we want to do. And then what I mentioned in the talk is whether I agree with it or not, a lot of my collaborators would not pass muster for what a funder would want to fund. They don't have the degree. They don't, it's all cyclical, right? It's like you have to have 10 grants to get the 11th. And so we do quite a bit of identifying the priority and then me leading the grant, but all around our colleagues' ideas just to get the funding so that they can do the work that they want to do. Now, that doesn't quite answer your question, which is how do you challenge the funders? And I do think, again, fundamentally how we're funding this work is challenged. On the one hand, I hear funders saying things that sound good, right? Like we need to see equitable collaborations, we need to see engagement and promotion of local ideas. They're saying all the right things. The reality is they keep funding the same types of projects. And so I, really think the funders do need to be challenged. As we talk about making fundamental change, they have to be challenged. Just one last thought that comes to mind with that. A few years ago, when I did start writing grants for like the National Institutes of Health, which is our main research funding body, I had said I want to put in explicit funding to promote the professional growth and careers of colleagues in Rwanda. We do that all the time for colleagues in the US, right? It's very common for me to put a PhD student in the US on a grant. And I wanted just the analogous equivalent of that. And folks really discouraged me from doing it. And interestingly, it was one of the best commented, most positively commented on aspects of the grant. And so I think sometimes we just have to remind ourselves, just because it's always been that way doesn't mean it always has to be that way. And maybe funders are looking for new and more innovative and more collaborative approaches. It's weird to not see anybody's faces who are asking the question. So I hope that answered the question that was asked.
I want to try again with Joey Villanueva. But while we're getting him, can you try? Can you talk? All right. Can Shima, are you able to speak?
Yes, hello, how are you? Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can, thank you.
So currently I'm working as a research coordinator in the National Center here in Sudan. I guess we had like a gap of knowledge in how to turn our researches to a publishable or a publishing abstract or paper. And the second thing that's included in the funding, how to pay for a high fees of the publishing journals, because we do a lot of researches, and here in Sudan we have like a really a good environment for researchers, especially those depend on the clinical findings or community-based researchers. But the thing is, we have really lack of knowledge and tool to turn those researchers into a publishable papers. So the knowledge, it's all, or the outcome or results of those researches are just, we keep them on shelves or on our desks. So how can we help in this problem? Thank you.
Thanks, Shima. Those are all really great points, and I think challenges that are shared by many. Yeah, I don't know if you have ongoing collaborators and partnerships in Sudan or others outside of Sudan that you can reach out to. One of the things that we recognize in our teams is that the challenges of writing an abstract and writing a paper are not unique just to our colleagues in Rwanda, but are just kind of unique to new researchers. And so one of the strategies we've tried to do, Shima, is offer opportunities that anybody who needs that support can access. So for example, we've been doing a like several month long, twice a week, stata/results writing / abstract and paper writing. We've been doing that, and it includes our colleagues in Rwanda, but it includes our colleagues, our fellows and RAs from PGSSC, and we're all just on the call together, kind of struggling through this together. So I don't know if there's opportunities, if you can find the individuals within Sudan or within collaborative networks that can support.
We could initiate a collaboration or something like that. Is it even possible? Because
I think so. And again, I suspect that there's probably other individuals on this call who might be in similar boats. So I think maybe, and I don't know how the chat or the Q&A function works, but
okay.
Folks who might want to join you on that journey, that's a helpful resource. The publication fees are also just, to me, just such a frustrating process, right? And as we talk about we fundamentally need to change these models, I think the publication model is one that just needs to be revisited. Like the idea that you have to have a really great idea in perfectly formed English to publish, to me, is just a system that I hope we change, much less, the publication fees also being one. As a sort of immediate, as those systems hopefully are being challenged, as an immediate answer, what I will say is there are many journals who have led the way in terms of not letting publication fees be barriers to emerging researchers. Either students, again, wherever they are in the world, that the publication fee is not going to prevent them from publishing, or particularly colleagues who are working on projects that are not funded or are underfunded. And so, just ones that come to mind, BMJ Global Health, Annals of Global Health, all of the BMC journals, you can write a petition to say, my name is Shima Ahmed. I am leading this paper from Sudan. Our research didn't have any funding, but we think it's really important to be published. Would you grant me a publication fee waiver? And I want to commend the journals for leading the way on this, but those specific journals, and I'm sure somebody's compiled a list, generally do grant fee waivers for papers that they publish if publication fees are your barrier.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Shima. That was a great question. We're running up on time. I want to combine two questions as our last one, two kind of related questions. One is, you mentioned recognizing more diverse forms of capital. What other forms of capital do you think are not being recognized? And relatedly, there's a question in here about the capital of time. HIC researchers with academic posts may be working with LMIC partners with full clinical loads. How do we deal with that?
Again, my quickest response to the legitimacy capital, so the symbolic capital, is the most recent piece that Cheyenne Mambola wrote. Really I had a lot of light bulbs going off as I read that piece. It talks a lot about the people, Shima, to your point, people are producing and using knowledge all over the world. What gets elevated and what gets valued is not universally recognized. And then there was also the quote from the recent blog that featured Salme Mswime, the individual in there was talking about how individuals who have research skills are valued, but individuals who have knowledge of patients and how this affects clinical care in his setting affects patients, that knowledge isn't legitimized. And so I do think we just need to interrogate that much more. There was recently a comment, something to the effect of, how do we engage collaborators if they don't know how to do a statistical analysis? And it's like, well, I engage a lot of US collaborators who don't know how to do statistical analysis. I am not a surgeon. I have no idea how to do surgery. That's the whole point of collaborative teams, is we all come with different knowledge and expertise. And for some reason, the skill sets that typically are more now traditionally held by individuals within the Royal College of Surgeons or PGSSC, for some reason, those expertise are more valued. And I think we just need to fundamentally just turn that on its head. The time one I think is an important one. And again, it gets back to me of like how we are a bit not always fair in how we think about the contributions in people's time. So it is very typical for me to have a research assistant. And when I'm very busy, to say, here's 3 ideas, turn that into an introduction, right? And for the research assistant to really support me in getting my ideas to papers. We tend to not, I have been participating in conversations and maybe even said, well, it's not fair that so-and-so isn't sitting down and writing this full paper. And I think we're not always fair in how we talk about how people use their time. One of the things that we do within our own program is to think about how our fellows and RAs who do have the luxury of time, they have a 1-year or 2-year fellowship, how they can support some of our collaborators as research assistants. Again, it's very typical for those of us working in academic institutions with heavy clinical roles to have research assistants. And so using individuals in our purview to support as research assistants, I think is important. It's also a great training opportunity for them, right? I learned the most when I was a research assistant because it was really about crafting ideas and articulating ideas. And so we see that as a win-win both for our fellows, but also for supporting our colleagues who have less time available.
Bethany, thank you very much for both the talk and also for engaging in these questions. Thanks also for kicking off our monthly Grand Round series. Let me just share my screen here. So thank you all for being here next month, same time, same day of the week, the first Wednesday of the month. We'll have Charlie Mock speaking to us. Charlie is also going to be talking about research and publishing in global surgery. So it's going to be a nice segue from Bethany's talk. Charlie is, in addition to having been a surgeon in Ghana forever, is an associate editor at the World Journal of Surgery. So hopefully we'll give some insight into the publishing world from behind the editor's desk. Thank you again, all of you, and I hope we will see you again next month.
Thank you all. And I left my email, so any comments or feedback is welcome. And I, again, really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.